Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, every time he looks at the set icon for the big score set, he thinks it looks less like a vault door and more like the Starship Enterprise. It's Matt Morgan.
Joey, there was a really weird crime that was committed lately. There's a Bath and Body Works down the street from my house, and they got robbed. I hear they took every last cent.
Huh. Wow. Okay. I see what you're doing there. And honestly, I'm all about it. Very on theme for the Outlaws of Thunder Junction stuff, too.
Committing crimes both in and out of the game. Who would have thought?
Wait, are you admitting to what you did? Is this a confession, Matt?
No, whoever did it.
Okay.
I think in order to find out who did it, they had to hire John Wick to find all the candles.
I just feel like you're in the hot dog suit right now being like, listen, we're all trying to figure out who did this.
right.
All right, up next, he's still trying to figure out why is there a Trojan horse card in the country western magic set? It's Dana Roach.
I had a rough day today. It took me probably 3 hours to clean my trampoline outside. It's that time of year. I just had to do some spring cleaning. But everything's set now. Squeaky. Plenty of propulsion on it. I should be good to go.
Much like daylight savings, that joke is really springing us ahead.
I just saw Matt like shaking his head a little bit. It's just like it didn't pass the Matt dad joke threshold. Yeah.
I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed.
The ultimate dad joke response right there. Yeah.
I mean, I think we just need to elevate our jokes a little bit more.
All right.
More altitude on them.
Let's jump into our main topic, actually. Matt, what are we talking about this week?
Well, this week we are going to ask ourselves the question, what is it that a deck wants versus what is it that a deck needs? And do we have any decks of ourselves that maybe have some wants, but they actually need something different?
Yeah, I'm way into this. I'm really excited for it. I am going to have to make sure I don't have like what a girl wants, what a girl needs stuck in my head the entire time that we're doing this show. But this is an exciting topic to me because I think at a passing glance, some decks look like or that you need more stuff of one thing, but that's not actually what the deck is after. They actually require something else to make sure that strategy can function, and it can be a little bit hard to suss out, so hopefully listeners get to learn a lot from this one. Real quick though, before we get into it, we got some shoutouts that we've got to do. Up first, we've got to thank Chase, aka Mana Curves, for their fantastic work with the post-production of the show. Chase, it's so much fun working with you. Thank you so much, Mana Curves.
We're also now proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. It's really easy to recommend a product you actually use, and we all use Ultimate Guard's products. We use the Katana sleeves to keep our cards safe. We use their Boulder deck boxes. All of their stuff is just second to none. They are rock solid. They're sleek. They're compact. They're just easy to use, and we can't recommend them highly enough, which is why that's what we use on our decks.
Absolutely. I'm huge fan. Those Boulder deck boxes are just aces. Like they are just, I love the compactness of them. It's so good.
So the both of you are saying that the Boulder deck boxes are rock solid. The math adds up. I'm glad that the wordplay really worked out.
There in the name.
Joey's getting in on the dad jokes too. But if you would like to support the show as well, you can do so. There are lots of ways to support us. You can like on these videos on YouTube, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on your local podcast app, leaving us a review over there. Those are all just free ways to support us, and we definitely appreciate all of that support. But if you would like to, you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast and join our Patreon community, which is great. It's absolutely fantastic. And you might be sitting here watching on a Friday. You could have already watched this episode. You could have gone to patreon.com/EDHRECast and watched days early. You can join our Discord community. There's all that and more, just great benefits that you can get for yourself for supporting us over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the weekly patron shoutouts. So this week, so much thanks. So many shoutouts are going over to Mace Mosner, who I don't even think Mace Mosner is a real name. It sounds like somebody that you interacted with in Star Wars on maybe one of the Star Wars video games, maybe Bad Batch. That's one of the new shows. Mace Mosner, if you are real, thank you so much for your support. If not, sweet character sheet for the Star Wars RPG.
I was going to say, it does have some D&D vibes, I'm not going to lie. Like, I feel like I've met the character in Baldur's Gate 3, probably. But truly, though, the support is real. And Mace, we 1,000,000,000% thank you so much for showing that support. It's terrific. And your name is so cool that we have to assume that you are from another really awesome IP or something, I guess, because of how cool your name is.
From a galaxy far, far away.
But not a long time ago. Right now. The support is right now. All right. Guys, let's get into it. We are talking about what a deck wants versus what a deck needs. And I'm hoping that this episode can be an interesting way to give viewers and listeners a new lens to examine their decks. And honestly, I'm hoping that it helps people avoid like potential win more cards or potential like trap pitfall kind of situations in their decks, because a deck might look like it wants more of a certain thing to make the strategy work, but it may not actually need more of those things. Maybe the commander already has that covered, for example, and maybe it actually needs support in a totally different way. And to get this started, I guess I'll actually use what was my inspiration for this topic was actually my Karazakar Goad deck, which I love. Karazakars, that Rakdos 5/5. Whenever you attack people, you get to goad their creatures. When your opponents attack each other, you get to draw cards, and you lose life when you draw those cards. And when I was building this deck, I was so excited to put in all of the goady stuff, like all of the Disrupt Decorums, all the Bothersome Closets, all of that stuff. And I do indeed play several of those goad cards. But my first couple times playing that deck, boy howdy did I lose really, really fast with that deck. And the commander was already doing so much goad on its own that I was like, did I need to put in 20 goad cards into my first draft of this deck? I don't know that I actually did. So I want to put this forward as like a first thing of like, this deck looked like it needed more goad, but it didn't. And I don't know, you guys have played against it. Can you think of what I needed instead of more goad? What was the thing that the deck actually needed support with? Like, you guys have played against it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like, when your commander does the thing your deck's trying to do, you probably generally need less support to do that thing. And then it raises the question, okay, well, if I'm doing this thing, what other problems does it cause? And in that case, it's losing a lot of life, I think.
It's so much
so
life.
That's probably the thing that needs fixing more than just more goad.
It was so much life. I lost to my own Karazakar triggers like 4 games in a row, you guys. I lost so much life to that ability. I drew so many cards. I was really happy about it. But yeah, I did not need a bunch of things to make goad work. What I needed was just any source of life gain at all. Even though those cards looked so much less exciting to put into a deck, just a casual something with like a Nighthawk Scavenger or whatever. But just gaining even 4 life was like really impactful when my commander was draining me for like so much damage every single turn. So that is my big example, kind of getting this ball rolling of like, I thought I needed a whole bunch of goad to make the strategy work. Turned out, no. What I needed was something to keep me alive.
Well, I think, Dana, you kind of mentioned a little bit of it when you have an effect in the command zone, and so it kind of takes out the need to put that effect into the 99 of a deck. One commander that I know the three of us, we've disagreed a lot about this specific commander, but Sithis Harvest Hand is a commander that, it is the most popular Selesnya commander of all time. It's the Enchantress, green and a white for a 1/2 that says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain a life and draw a card. We've gone back and forth on this show, and Dana, I know that you've said the deck doesn't really need Sithis in the command zone, but I also think you can reverse that a little bit, where you look at the Sithis deck, and you still see a bunch of the classic Enchantress cards, whether it's Enchantress's Presence, Jukai Naturalist, and all that. And Naturalist, I think, is great because it's a cost reducer, but then you also have Mesa Enchantress, and all these cards are showing up in over 70% of decks. I don't think a Sithis deck actually needs all that many Enchantress type of draw engines in the deck, because you have that effect in the command zone. Now, maybe really what you need to do is find a way to convert all that value and all that card draw into a meaningful way to win, which is, in my experience, that's the biggest problem with a lot of these style decks.
Yeah, my initial comments when this card was previewed haven't changed. I still think you are almost exclusively better off in an Enchantress deck with a win condition in the command zone than you are with one of 14 draw engines in the command zone. But if you made the decision that you are going to have Sithis in the zone, whether or not it's better than Sigarda, Host of Hurons or something, is irrelevant. You've made that decision. You want Sithis. So if you've made that choice, then I 100% agree. Your focus needs to be a little bit less on draw engines, despite the fact that like your knee-jerk reaction to seeing a Selesnya Enchantress deck is jam every single Enchantress into the deck as possible. you can get away with running less of them if Sithis is already in the zone and focus much more on like ways to actually turn those into wins.
That, I think, is going to be one of the biggest, like, I think there are a lot of examples. I think Brago probably enters the conversation here a little bit too, of what this commander looks like. You want to have all of these things of like ways to find more value, draw more cards, have a couple more things in play. That sounds, but like, it is truly the question of, okay, now how's this game ending though?
Right.
And Sithis is a big culprit there, and that's why like one of the most popular utility artifacts on Sithis' page is an Aetherflux Reservoir, because all the life that you're gaining, you can actually pay it to have some damage go somewhere finally, and actually close something out. So yeah, Sithis can draw so many cards, but if none of them win the game, that's a problem. So like the thing that this deck does need to focus on isn't just, look at how many cards I'm drawing. You, Matt, as you said, you need to find a way for the Brago, the Sithis, any of those to actually convert that into a way to end the game and not just like have a 17 turn long experience.
Yeah, and you're in Selesnya color, so it's not even like you have access to Laboratory Maniac and those types of win the game effects when you draw your deck out, because you're not playing blue. And so looking at the average deck on Sithis and just seeing all these draw engines, but like very rarely as a way to actually win. Like you have Setessan Champion, I guess, that gets big, but also that's drawing you a bunch of cards still. So like that's a way, but also, yeah, you just need to find ways to actually win, and they're kind of few and far between when you look at the average Sithis deck.
That's so true. Like Sigil of the Empty Throne, which makes 4/4 angels, that shows up in 3/4 of Sithis decks, and that's great. But then the next one is like Archon of Sun's Grace, which only makes 2/2s.
Yeah.
And that one's showing up in 62%. And I'm like, I'm scrolling down, and the next like most popular win con effect that I'm even seeing would be like a Heliod Suncrowned and Walking Ballista combo. And it's no surprise to me that when a commander does produce this much value, that people feel like they want to resort to a combo just to make it easy. Just to be like, all right, well, I've got something that'll make the game finally end quick after I've spent so many turns just drawing. So like a win con density is to me the thing to pay attention to in a deck like this. You can't just have a couple of win cons in the deck. Even if your commander is drawing that many cards, having more than just one or two ways to make sure that this deck can actually close things out feels important to me.
Yeah, very much so. I think so. In a general sense, one thing I'll say here, and this might make more sense at the end in the summary, but I'll say it now since it had to have it fresh in our minds. There are definitely people out there, I'm sure, who build a deck and then take it to their friend's house or their LGS or spell table, and it immediately functions perfectly the first time they play it. But by and large, that's not how it works. I think for the most part, when you take a deck out for your first test runs, you should start seeing things that you didn't anticipate. And if that doesn't happen to you, I would say err on the side of the fact that you're not paying attention to the things you should be noticing versus all my decks are perfect every single time right out of the gate. I don't think that's generally how it works. And these are things we've caught in our own decks that like, oh, I didn't realize this till I started playing. So I do think for the most part, everyone's deck, when you first build it, you probably should catch some of these things for, more often than not.
I would go so far as to like liken it to what they say about gambling. Like the worst thing that can happen to you the first time you gamble is that you win big.
Yeah,
because then it tricks your brain into thinking that you will always win big. If your deck performs really well on its first time, I think that can actually, like, the excitement of that can hide any problems that are actually happening with that deck, and you expect that deck to perform that way again later down the line, and it's easier for you to miss the flaws that are actually present there. So I would almost liken it to that. Like, first forays, I hope that you see some flaws, because that means that you're cued into the stuff that you need to be cued into.
Yeah, well, and if you're truly trying to make your deck better, and some people, maybe they're not, and I'm kind of in that camp too of, I just want to build a deck, and like, I'll kind of assess it as we go, but it doesn't need to be immediately like, I'm looking every single game to improve the deck. I'm trying to draw a conclusion from every game. If that's the way that you play, I get it. I am in that camp. But also, if you are truly trying to keep your deck improving over time, every time you play it, taking a critical eye, just not accepting, oh, well, I won, that means nothing's wrong, that you can still find a lot to learn in those games that you win too, because you can also look at, well, I had to overcome this obstacle, or this was where I really had to turn the corner. And so there's a lot you can learn from both wins and losses.
The most recent example of this, when I built my Calfay Beloved of the Sea deck, I knew it was going to be a mono blue auras based deck, the win condition being commander damage. The problem is blue doesn't have a lot of auras. That's not really what blue does for the most part. But I thought, okay, well, because of the way devotion works, I can still put a mediocre blue aura on my commander, and because she gets buffed by devotion, therefore it would offset the fact that the auras aren't very good. What I then realized in playing it was, well, then I'm putting all my eggs in one basket with these mediocre auras, and if my commander gets removed, then the rebuilding process is really long. Whereas if I just run a bunch of really good utility enchantments that sit in play and have devotion pips on them, then if my commander gets removed, I can just play my commander again, and she's immediately rebuilt via the devotion versus the auras. And then it let me focus on only running like flash auras that grant hexproof or something for protection and things of that nature. So I then rebuilt, a good chunk of that deck and pulled a lot of the buff auras out and just replaced them with things that were just generally good that sat there and required someone to actually run like a sweeper to remove all my enchantments versus just destroying my commander and taking out 4 or 5 things at once. And that was one of those things. I had to play that to get that feel for it.
I mean, Dana, I think that kind of moves right back into the whole topic of like what you think the deck wants versus what it needs in terms of like Voltron decks. I think really cool auras that buff up the Voltron look so enticing. But most commonly, what you actually need for your Voltron deck are like evasive keywords and protective keywords, and especially protective spells to keep that thing alive, because it is the linchpin of your strategy. So, when the few times that I've dabbled with Voltron decks, I'm like, oh, I can't wait to put this on it and this on it, and I can't wait to use these cards to cheat them into play on it, and that sounds so exciting, and it's going to be huge. And it turns out you don't need that many things that buff it.
Yeah.
You actually just need to make sure it don't die, because if it do, then you are back at square one, and it takes you like 3 turns to rebuild. And so that is very much what this deck needs is protection. What it looks like it wants is this thing to be as big as possible and really cool. But like the equipments that you actually prioritize end up being like the Sword of X and Y to give it protection from colors and to give it a little bit of evasiveness, for example, rather than just raw buffs, rather than just some cool keywords. You end up like prioritizing the protection so much in Voltron decks for exactly that reason.
I mean, since we're talking about Voltron, I will also mention this one. I have a Voltron equipment deck that's in Azorius colors, using Arden and Essior. When I built that deck, because of Arden's ability that allows you to equip stuff for free, I assumed I would want to run a bunch of like big bomb equipments that you normally don't want to put in a deck because the equip cost is so expensive. Mm-hmm. And again, rebuilding becomes challenging. So I'm like, I'm definitely going to be having an Argentum armor in here since I don't need to pay the 6 mana to equip it, or Cauldron Complete, or things of that nature. And yes, you can cast that thing for the 7 mana for Cauldron Complete, and you can equip it for free. And I guess that's pretty good. But that, to me, wound up being not nearly as good as casting 1 or 2 much cheaper pieces of equipment, and then because I'm in blue, still having mana available for counterspells to protect my stuff.
Right.
So despite the fact that like that is a deck where I can equip things for free because of Arden, I have 1 piece of equipment that costs 5 mana, and that's Batterskull. I have nothing at 4, and everything else is 3 or less. Because that deck, it seemed like it wanted real bombs, but it didn't. It wanted careful, cautious, efficient pieces of equipment that allowed me to protect that Voltron stack and keep it in play, and then just grind everybody down.
I feel like Matt's biggest lament with his Valduk deck is that it doesn't have the ability to counter spells or to use heroic interventions to protect his
Hold up. It has Pyroblast. I don't know. It can counter spells. But also, like, I also have an Arden, but mine is partnered with Ketis, and it's kind of the same thing. So I had to be very careful about what bomb equipments am I playing in. And I also have Batterskull in there, but also I took a lot of inspiration from your deck as far as, so what does your Azorius colored kind of a Voltron type of commander deck want to do versus mine that's in Boros colors? And then also taking that difference, and then what can I gain by having red versus you having blue? And so I was able to find what that deck wants to do, and where I'm not playing blue, so I don't have access to as many counterspells, still have Pyroblast, still have red Elemental Blast. Thank you very much. But leaning into what the deck actually like needed to be doing, which was maximizing every combat step, which you're not able to do in mono blue. So your approach, it needed to be a little more grind people down, have multiple combat steps, whereas mine was, I need to have 1 big turn. So I leaned into stuff like Hexplate Wallbreaker, which gives me extra combat steps. Or one card that I just absolutely love is Kamainu Battle Armor, which is another equipment that it's 4 mana for a reconfigure, but it also, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it goads all of your opponent's creatures, which means I'm able to kind of fog that one player for a turn. So I'm able to fog Dana, who is going to grind me down on the next turn, distract that a little bit other different places. So those are just a few things that even just taking inspiration from a similar style deck and finding out your deck needs to do something else, but I don't need that because I'm in different colors. But still, there are valuable lessons to kind of comparing those just because of some of the overlap, either in color or in strategy.
I mean, I would even say when it comes to like, Matt, you're the king of aggro here on this podcast. You've got
I agree.
all these, you're being so humble about it.
I agree.
Okay, there it is. But like, yeah, you've got, here's an example of like a Voltron type of aggro, but you've also got your Raga Draga, which is so many creatures in play. You've also got your Kyler, which is so many creatures in play. And I think for Kyler, it would be very apparent that like what that deck needs is like absolutely to have enough human like creatures in play to get the Kyler buff, but then you need to protect them. You need your heroic interventions. You need your Tef Bros and stuff like that. And when it comes to other colors that maybe don't have access to that, like your mono red or like your Boros that you're describing there, it seems one of the things that you're shifting into as a way of doing that is just like, let me make this damage faster. Like, yeah, in lieu of I need to protect my stuff, let me just make sure that I can, the thing that I actually need is to make sure that the damage I deal to the person who's my biggest threat who could wipe my board, what I need is player removal. It's kind of what I think I'm hearing a little bit, and that's another way that you've evaded this for the aggro decks that don't necessarily have quite the highest density of protective stuff like you would usually expect for some of these other versions.
Yeah, I mean, player removal is the best threat removal, and so you can't kill my creatures if I have already knocked you out of the game. But also, you mentioned Kyler, and that is absolutely another example of a card or a commander, I should say, that it looks like it wants just a critical mass, but also you need a good amount of protection because once you've built Kyler up, people kind of know it's coming. You talk about how I love commanders and decks that put everything on the boards. I'm not going to surprise you terribly often. That's why cards like Slippery Bogbonder is such a perfect card for Kyler because it triggers humans. It is a human itself, but also it protects your Kyler. And yes, it does have flash, so a little bit of surprise factor. I surprised you by saying I wasn't going to surprise you. But that's absolutely true. Like that is another example of what a card wants, but also it's what the deck needs.
Well, and especially I've seen, I've done an upping the average video on Kyler before. And like in the average deck for Kyler, sometimes we see humans in there that buff other humans. And it's just like, you don't need that many of them because Kyler's kind of got that down on lock. And that's how actually I feel about my zombie deck as well. Like, the zombies that buff up other zombies are kind of the least important zombies in the entire thing. Yeah. And you think, oh, you want a whole bunch of them. And it's like, yeah, I want some, but I don't need a whole bunch of them. What I actually need are the things like Hordewing Scob that give them flying, because that's a unique ability that none of the other zombies can do. And it makes my opponents have to like, suddenly they're fighting on a completely different axis than what they thought. So the most powerful humans in your Kyler deck are the utility ones, are the ones that protect your board, not just the stuff that makes it raw power.
And I think that's kind of a problem with a lot of, you can kind of go overboard with needing or thinking you need with Kindred decks. A Kyler Sigardian Emissary deck, maybe you're playing a bunch of Lords. You don't actually need them because you have a Lord in the command zone. I think that applies to just a lot of decks, not just these specific ones that we're touching on, just because we know these decks personally. But there's a lot of them out there that just kind of fall into a certain umbrella just because of the strategy that you're playing.
Yeah, very much. You do need sometimes some backup plans, but like a Door of Destinies in your Kyler deck is not a level of redundancy you've ever felt the need to get.
No.
But on that note, one thing we do need to do too is challenge some stats, you guys, because there's so much data here on EDHREC, but we don't always agree with all of it, such as, Door of Destinies in a Kyler deck, for example. So let's take a quick break and come back with some challenges on the EDHREC data.
Now, Joey, you say that we need to, but I think we want to. We're all on the same page here.
This is true. That's true. Okay, so y'all know I'm from Seattle, famously a land of rain. Like, no joke, when I went to MagicCon Chicago in February, the weather there was nicer than it was back home. I am not kidding. Chicago was sunny as heck, but when I got back to Seattle, it was so wet everywhere. And you know what I really cannot abide when that happens? Wet feet. So, since I'm a Seattleite, I have been on the lookout for some properly waterproof shoes, and that's why I am so happy that this episode is sponsored by Vessi. Their weekend sneakers and Stormburst low tops are everything, and in this instance, they were a lifesaver. They go with everything, whether I'm walking in the city streets or I want to go do an outdoor hike. Did I just say an outdoor hike? Like, as compared to what? An indoor hike? Whatever. I'm keeping it because I like these shoes. How they manage to be waterproof and also this lightweight and breathable so that your feet stay dry and cool even when you're hit by a sudden rain shower is a work of art. They're just awesome for unpredictable weather. And they look good. I like a shoe that can feel very work casual, and that's also good for like weekend adventures. A great fit for the summer coming up. Elevate your summer activities with Vessi's Stormburst and Weekend shoes. Discover more at vessi.com/EDHRE. Get your pair today to get an automatic 15% off your first purchase at checkout, and be ready to stay cool and dry. All right, I'm going to start us off with Challenge the Stats this week, and honestly, this is kind of a left field pick, but there are a certain archetype of cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty that I just think deserve a second look, particularly if you're playing a commander with a background, since you've already got an enchantment in the command zone there. There are a whole bunch of cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty that care if you control both an artifact and an enchantment. They'll give you extra benefits. For example, we've mentioned Roadside Reliquary being really fun in decks. That's the land that you can cash in for extra cards, and drawing 2 cards if you have like all random treasure token and also a background enchantment that's just right there from your command zone. It's really easy to cash in on cards like that. And some of those are a little bit more well known, but I want to highlight specifically the card Assassin's Ink for Barakos decks. Assassin's Ink is a 4-mana instant that costs 1 less to cast if you have an artifact and 1 less to cast if you control an enchantment, and it destroys a creature or planeswalker. So if you're playing Barakos, who makes a whole bunch of treasure tokens, it's really easy for this to just cost 2 mana. Now, if you're playing a Barakos and Folk Hero deck, like I have a Barakos and Folk Hero deck, you've already got so many white and black removal spells, you probably do not need this one. But if you're playing something like, for example, Barakos and Haunted one, which is mono black, then this can just be a really easy way to have just a constantly 2-mana destroy target creature spell that isn't going to, for instance, cost you 2 life in the way that an Infernal Grasp would. And it's only showing up in 2 total Barakos and Haunted 1 decks right now. I don't know, just if you're playing a couple of weird off-color stuff things with Barakos, you've got the enchantment there in your command zone already. Your commander makes a bunch of artifacts. There are a couple of other background commanders that also fit this type of description. So consider giving this a little bit more off-the-wall removal spell a look. If you are hard up for cool removal, I think that people will be really surprised and really pleased when they see one like this. Assassin's Ink and other Neon Dynasty cards that care about having both an artifact and an enchantment. If you're playing a lot of treasures, a lot of artifacts, even just mana rocks, and you got an enchantment in the command zone already, give them a look. I think they're kind of neat.
I want to talk about the card Scene of the Crime here briefly today. It's an artifact land for Mirzet Markov Manor. Comes into play tapped, and you can tap it for a colorless mana. You can spend 2 to sacrifice it to draw a card, or you can tap an untapped creature you control to add a mana of any color. That's not the card I'm challenging, though. I'm challenging the card Prototype Portal. Prototype Portal is 5 mana, and when it comes into play, you imprint an artifact card, and then you can spend X and tap it to make a token copy of that imprinted artifact card. The reason I mentioned Scene of the Crime is an artifact land, and for a lot of years, we basically just had the 2 original Mirrored Artifact lands on Darksteel Citadel, but over the last few years, we've gotten a couple more. We got the Artifact Dual lands, we got Power Depot, we got Treasure Vault, and now we have Scene of the Crime. And we're at the point right now where it's possible to run a pretty significant density of artifact lands in a deck that cares about them. And if you look through EDHREC, you will see that there's a lot of people running artifact lands just to power up things like Nettle Cyst or other things that care about the amount of artifacts in your deck. If you are doing that, it is probably worth taking a long look at Prototype Portal for your deck, just because you can imprint an artifact land under it, and for 0 mana tap it every single turn to make a token copy of a land. It's a pretty good way to ramp, and maybe 5 or 6 years ago it wasn't worth running for that purpose. At this point, with the amount of artifact lands we have, plus, Soul Ring that you can tap it for 1 and make a Soul Ring copy. There's just so many really cheap targets to put under Prototype Portal for ramp options nowadays that if you're already doing those things, I would take a long look at running Prototype Portal. It's only in about 9,000 decks, and I think there's more room for that out there. I think this is one of those wants versus need things almost. I think people want to put something huge underneath it, and I think the card really shines when you're doing it for 0 mana.
Yeah, I look at that card and my wheels get spinning. I was like, oh, what can I make a bunch of copies of that are super big and expensive? But then I agree, Dana, this becomes a 4-mana repeatable ramp source, and that's incredibly valuable.
A lot of stuff that triggers when artifacts enter the battlefield too, so it's nice to get those.
Yeah.
I do have to point out though that I know this is the meme upon memes. It's the oldest joke at this point, but you did say Murders at Markov Manor completely by accident because we always will. We always will for the rest of time call it Murders at Markov Manor. It's the worst set name to say Murders at Karlov Manor. Murders at the house of a ghost. Like, yeah, murder happens. Not a whole lot of mystery, but like it's also just we immediately want to do the alliteration, and so it's just so funny. So anyway, I had to call that out because I know that some listeners' brains were exploding out there.
Well, I'm going to wrap us up this week, and so this week I have a listener submitted challenge, which comes to us from one of our Patreon members in our Discord community. So Han Shot First, which agree, Han did shoot first. Sent us a message in our Discord that said, I have a challenge that's pretty easy to overlook, but it's for a non-bow in Chainer Nightmare Adept deck. So for those of you who don't remember, Chainer Nightmare Adept is 2 and a Rakdos that says you can discard a card and you may cast a creature spell from your graveyard this turn, activated only once each turn, and then whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if you didn't cast it from your hand, it gains haste until your next turn. So right there, it's reanimating, it's casting things from your graveyard, a lot of stuff going on there. But Han points out that Chainer's deck is full of awesome graveyard shenanigans, but notably includes cards like Flare of the Hatebound and Phyrexian Dragon Engine that care about entering the battlefield from the graveyard. Now, while Chainer's got a lot of standard reanimation effects in the 99, the activated ability casts the creatures from the yard, which means they go to the stack and then enter the battlefield instead of triggering from the graveyard type of effects. Mm-hmm. The secondary haste kind of takes this into account, but depending on the makeup of the individual lists, it might not be able to consistently trigger Flare type of effects that players think initially. And so this is absolutely true, and Flare of the Hatebound is still showing up in a good amount of Chainer decks, almost 40%, and this is kind of proof that people weren't really paying attention the last time that we talked about this, because back in episode 144, we actually had another listener submit this exact challenge. Flare the Hatebound doesn't work with Nightmare Adept. And so if folks weren't listening 3 years ago to us, maybe listen this time to when our listeners are just kind of pointing out, hey, kind of a non-bow, you're not getting Flare the Hatebound type of effects. Maybe you shouldn't be playing that in these Chainer Nightmare Adept decks. It's still showing up at a significant percentage. So Han, thanks for pointing this out again. It was a great challenge back then. It's a great challenge now because players have had 3 years to learn that's not how it works. Now, precon effect, I get it, but also you can still take the cards out.
You can't, or just be especially conscious of like, do I have enough direct reanimation in this deck to still make that effect worth it? Mm-hmm. But like, don't get got by the non-bow. So Han, thank you so much for submitting that again, because if the data is still where it was at 3 years ago, you're right, we got to challenge that. Thank you so much, Han.
Well, let's get back into the main topic then. So Joey, I know that there's a certain archetype that you have in mind that maybe has some differing wants and needs. So let's hear it. What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, this is kind of a broad umbrella rather than just a specific deck for me. But I mean, we've all dabbled in the landfalls. And listen, I hate for this to just come down to maybe play more lands. But when you're playing landfall, maybe play more lands. Because I think when folks are building landfall, and we all get trapped in this, we all understand this. Like this totally, all those cool landfall cards are so spicy and exciting and fun. And like you jam a whole bunch of them into the deck because you think the deck needs a whole lot of landfall stuff. Like Matt, you've got your Omnath of Rage deck, and you're just like, cool, let me get as many cool Scoot Swarmy type of things that are going on in this deck so that I can have a bunch of awesome stuff whenever I play a single land. But like straight up, we have seen decks in the database before where like, we've seen a landfall deck that only had 34 lands in it. Like, I'm not even kidding. That is a thing that happened to me when I was doing an Upping the Average video. And I'm just like, if you're in landfall, I think you need the fuel. I think you need the fuel for those things to happen. So, and Matt, you've actually even said that, like, you don't play a whole lot of extra landfall payoffs, I think for exactly this reason. Like, yeah, you don't play Rampaging Baloths in your landfall deck, right?
Correct. Yeah. So what you want, you think you want is a bunch of payoffs. But really, I can't imagine playing a landfall deck with less than 45 lands.
45 even.
Absolutely wild to me because 45, and that's being generous. So I have an AC Tyrant of Dire Straits deck that plays pretty greedy, but also it's because I'm always going to be seeing all the lands. And I also have a lot of ways to recur lands and bounce lands back to my hand. So there's a strategic choice with that deck specifically. But absolutely, like you can overdo it with payoff cards in a landfall deck. Whereas it's very, very easy to strip all the basics because a vast majority of ramp spells pull basic lands out of your deck. And if you're in green, you can pull forests specifically, but even then it's a little more limited. So if you are playing a landfall deck, you need basics in there. You're going to run out of fuel. Players underestimate that so often. All three of us got an email a couple years ago. Somebody was playing a landfall deck with 32 lands, and my brain exploded.
I mean, I'm sympathetic to folks who struggle with this one. In the best of circumstances, in a deck where you're like, oh, I only need 35 lands for this deck to function really well, it's still difficult to find room for all the cards you want to run. So when you tell someone, man, you should have 8 more lands in this particular deck for your strategy, that is to a degree one of the reasons I no longer have a landfall deck.
Okay, wow.
It was like the making the decisions was so difficult. So like I sympathize, but you are 100% correct. You just have to resign yourself for that deck to work the way you want it to work. You are going to have less room for all the toys.
You need the fuel for the things to work. And especially with Landfall, like Matt, as you don't have Rampaging Baloths and the Omnath there because you're like, it's easy for me to replay Omnath a lot, and it's already making 5/5s, and I don't need both of those things in play.
Yeah.
And Rampaging Baloths, I don't need as a significant backup because it's just attacking on basically the same axis that Omnath already is, and it's not difficult for you to replay Omnath because of how many lands you are playing and hitting those land drops consistently. Nothing feels worse than when you are playing Landfall, and you've got 3 Landfall triggers in play, and no lands to actually play with them. So, Matt, you said 45 lands. I'll admit that's actually high for me. I never go below 40. I usually average about 42 lands in my Landfall stuff. But even then, it is like, you need the fuel, you need the fodder. It's not exciting, but it is what the deck needs. And even though it looks like you want a bunch of those payoffs, at some point it becomes too many cooks in the kitchen, and they just need fuel for for even one of them to start working. So just play the fuel. Just play the fuel.
Well, and Dana, you joke about you want to play more fun cards. When you're playing the right Landfall payoffs, the lands are the fun cards. So so really,
very true.
But it is kind of funny that like a lot of players kind of have that mental hurdle though of, well, I don't want to play a bunch of lands because they're not fun. Like, well, they actually can be. But it also, like, you have to kind of shift your paradigm a little bit too when you're playing that, because lands typically, nobody gets excited about like what their land base is going to look like. A lot of players, I would wager, okay, I'm just going to hit the auto mana base filler. I'll build it out that way. You could put a lot of really fun things in your commander decks.
There's a line in Moneyball where Brad Pitt's character says, "I hate losing more than I like winning," and that's to a degree here a little bit true. Yes, you want to run those fun cards, but you know what's more fun than running fun cards? Not losing every game because you don't have enough lands.
Yeah.
Like there's fun to be had in your deck actually working.
And it's not exciting. It's not the sexy version. Like, you want to play the cool stuff, but like, you have to have the bases actually covered. It's a little bit like when artifact decks have all of these effects, like efficient construction and like an Aether Mage Vidalcan kind of thing. It's just like, whenever you play an artifact, you get extra tokens. Whenever you play an artifact, you get to draw extra cards. And it's like, okay, cool, but where are your artifacts though? Because I see a lot of payoffs, and I don't see anything that's actually going to make the strategy work yet. You've got like room for, I guess, 4 artifacts left in the deck. Like, you can't rope yourself into that situation. You got to cut out some of the exciting payoffs so that you actually have enough fuel for any of the payoffs to ever work.
So many years ago, I built a Talrand Sky Summoner deck. It's one of the first commander decks I built very early on in my EDH career. And I'll tell this story. I know I've told it before years ago, but the main reason I built Talrand was there was a guy in my meta who hated blue decks and was a notorious cheater. So my thought process was, I'll build a blue deck filled with counter spells just to play when I'm stuck in a pod with this player. Eventually that person is no longer in my meta, so I have this Talrand deck that I built and decided to actually then think about what I was going to do with it, given that I wasn't just playing it against this one person. Initially, I had assumed that was going to be a control deck. I was going to, stop people from doing stuff with counter spells, which would then make me a Drake, which was useful as well. And I thought eventually that was how it would play. That's not how that deck really winds up working, though. It's a token deck that makes tokens running really efficient spells. And even though that feels like less clever than using counter spells to make tokens, running really bad cantrips that make you Drakes is just a better way to win games. And it's also more fun. I found actually, like, again, having the deck work is more fun than having a deck not work. And that was a situation where I was being a little bit stubborn for a while, particularly it was early in my Magic career. But once I realized, oh, it's a token deck, I'm just going to do things that make tokens, then all the pieces fell into place.
Yeah, well, and sometimes the deck wants to be something completely different than what you set out to do.
Yeah.
I've kind of had that experience a couple times too, where I thought, hey, my Miri deck was, I just want to make everything combat focused. And that deck has gotten reworked. That's become my Tristani Concordant deck. But Miri, when it first started out, I want to make it as hard to tap things down. I want to put Glare of Subdual in there. But then I realized I'm just going through a lot of hoops to make things really awkward. I can just turn things sideways and just overrun them with just the amount of value. And so I was trying to just maybe sometimes get too cute. And Dana, you were trying to build with a specific purpose, but then you kind of found out the way that you play specifically kind of didn't fall in line with what the deck actually wanted to do.
You also had that struggle with Alibu as well, I recall.
Yeah. Alibu was the worst.
Well, and so, like, I think that commander, it was really asking for a different bit. Like, Alibu is like artifacts, but specifically, like, it's burning a whole bunch. It is using artifacts as a means towards burn. And that isn't what you were trying to do. You were trying to find that more of a value type of way of playing it. And, like, those were just you were vibrating at two completely different frequencies. So it was not working out for you. And so, yeah, sometimes the thing that you are trying to do with it is just like, ultimately, maybe that wasn't the particular deck configuration or potentially even the right commander for what you were after. And it's no surprise that you moved on to other artifacty pastures as a result of that. And with your Miri example there too, it's been interesting to see that evolve, Mr. Selesnya.
I mean, yeah, and then I got to actually kind of create and then naturally ease my way into a deck that actually, it did what I wanted to do, which was something a little bit different than the typical deck, but also still is being powerful and still, again, turning things sideways. King of Aggro, I get it. I have a type.
Having a type, I don't know what you could possibly mean about having a type.
No, Mr. Necromancer yourself.
Well, and I guess to like, I'll try and break away from my usual type here, not just talk about necromancy. I think Superfriends as an archetype is also another really important one to discuss here for what it looks like a Super Friends deck wants, like from an outside perspective, versus when you're actually in the experience of playing with a bunch of Planeswalkers, you realize real fast what it is that you actually need to make that deck work. From the outside, I really feel like whenever I see people recommend cards for a Super Friends deck, I see a lot of proliferate stuff, because proliferating, making those Planeswalkers get to their ults a little bit faster, that sounds so exciting. And it's not like proliferate cards are bad or unnecessary in a Super Friends deck, but they're certainly a thing that you do after you got your bases covered, rather than the base you need to cover. The base you need to cover with Super Friends, I mean, when I had a Lord Windgrace deck, like, I learned really fast that my favorite things to play were any blocker ever. Just like, please let me defend my dude. And Dana, you have a Super Friends deck. I'm sure you can relate to this about needing some defenses first.
Yeah, the fact that the commander in that deck has vigilance is really, really useful. But yeah, I mean, like, that for Super Friends, for me, it's one of those things that I agree with you. I see people like, oh, I'm going to build this Super Friends list. And the first question, like, I always say to them is, so how are you going to win?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to run some proliferate effects and like roll these Planeswalkers. I'm like, right, but do their ults win you games?
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of them don't. Now, my Planeswalker deck happens to be in mono white, where almost every Planeswalker makes tokens. So, like, I've just through years of playing with the deck realized that that's also a token deck, and I can run things that like buff those tokens, and that's what the win condition is in that deck. All of the things those Planeswalkers are doing are leading to me towards a token win. But that's not the case in a lot of Planeswalker decks. I see plenty of them where like folks are focused on doing Planeswalker things, and there's no way to actually like turn a game into a victory doing those things. That's
a good point. There's kind of like both of those two needs are really big priorities with Super Friends compared to some of the other stuff that seems most exciting to put in there first. Like, it is both the win and also just like having defenses to establish to make sure you can even get to those ults. So it's kind of like the early and the late game are the bookends of the experience for Super Friends are very much the things that you have to focus on, because the mid game sounds like it's going to take care of itself.
Yeah, very often, yes.
Well, and I guess, going through a handful of these examples, one of the things that like it occurred to me why I wanted to like tackle this as a potential like podcast topic and have a conversation about it is because I think this is an important lens I feel like this lens is most important when you're like in the position of potentially giving deck advice to other people, because I think this is where we can get really tripped up when we're just viewing something from an outside perspective. The experience that you have of looking at a deck list is so fundamentally different than the experience of playing that deck. And so like the recommendations that I see given to, for example, that Superfriends list tend to be those big, splashy, exciting cards. But there is actually, it turns out, a reason that the pilot is not playing those. It's because maybe they already tried, but it turned out they had to have some of those bases covered first before they could even think about focusing on this cool, big, splashy, exciting stuff. They had to make sure that the wheels were greased and the wheels couldn't move in the first place. As another example, I've used Babala Saga as an example a couple of times, this precise example, but like a thing that I'll get recommended to me a lot for that deck are, have you considered this enchantment creature or this thing that also makes artifact tokens and stuff? And it's just like, that's actually a base I've already got covered. And what the deck needed was, going back to that Sithis example, I needed some dang win conditions in that deck. And that was actually harder. In the experience of playing the deck, I was like, how do I win this dang game? I can't just win by doing 3 chunks of life to my opponents each turn. That is not a win con. And those were not things that were immediately obvious to me when I first started playing those decks. And so this is kind of just a way of like, when you're on the outside of a deck looking at it from a completely different view, it is kind of just like a reminder to reposition and try and figure out. I don't know. Just I hope that having this lens of like reconsidering those can help us all like be good at giving deck advice to each other and making sure that we keep in mind those difficulties, because those difficulties are so not apparent from the outside. And that's just an important lens that I think is worth doing when you're trying to improve anyone's deck, including other folks and your own.
I think just in life in general, it's useful to be open-minded about challenging presuppositions you had. But I think, like, especially in Magic, that's very true when it comes to brewing a new deck. Just because you had this sense of how the deck was going to work and play doesn't make that true. And you should be very open-minded about, like we kind of said, what the deck is telling you while you're playing it, because a lot of times it can show you as you play it what it wants to be doing, even if you weren't aware that's what that thing was.
Well, and two, just sometimes, again, what a person wants to do in a game is just very, very different. And so being able to shift and kind of buy into that and just using that as your own lens, challenging your own presuppositions is super, super important, but being able to adjust that to what other people are trying to do too when you're giving them deck building advice, or even giving yourself advice and trying to kind of thought process through all of that, it really can be a challenging kind of process to get to that point.
And I think too, it's a useful question to ask as well, because we kind of all go into a typical deck building experience with the expectation of like, all right, well, I think what I need is removal. What I need is ramp. What I need is this. What I need is that. Like a couple of things that have carried over from our experiences building other decks. And it's entirely possible that when you move into this one, into this other deck, your needs are going to be radically different. Like that Sithis example.
Yeah.
Like it's drawing so many cards that like, I'm not just going to play some random card draw spell in that deck, because I don't play random card draw spells in my Babala Saga deck. My commander done draws me so many cards that I just don't need any of those extra things. Or, you know, you've played other Kindred decks before, Matt, and so Door of Destinies would be great in those, but you don't need it in that Kyler deck because the commander's already got that base covered. And so that's going to completely shift your expectations with those. It's going to be very, very different. So like knowing what the commander has covered is going to change what you think you need compared to the previous stuff you've built. And so this is just another way to remind yourself, what do I actually need? Not just what do I think I need?
Well, and that's such a huge thing too, is to getting away from directive feedback where, oh, you should do this. Turn it into inquisitive. Turn it into, what are you trying to do? What is your favorite thing to do with this deck? Not just asking other people, but ask yourself. Ask yourself questions of, why did I build this specific commander to begin with? Am I able to get there? So instead of, I need to do this, what do I want to do? And that's going to kind of direct it, because then once you answer what you want to do, then you can answer, what do I need to do to fuel that other thing that I'm wanting to be able to do?
I love that. That's such a great note to end on.
I have good ideas now and then. It's not often, but it does happen.
It has been known to happen. All right, yeah. I love that, listeners. We've gotta hear. We don't just want. We need to hear
feedback
from you. Yeah, about your experiences with this. What are the lessons that you've learned in this way, where you thought the deck was after one thing, but it turned out it actually needed something else entirely? And especially like when it comes to giving the feedback for others, that we want and need to hear from you about your experiences with this topic. So with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. And if our listeners would like to get in touch with us, fellas, where can they find us online? Matt?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you go to any events coming up, you see us out there, we're going to be rocking Ultimate Guard gear. It's just the best out there. So make sure you pick up some for yourself as well.
And Dana, how about you?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me online at Joseph M. Schultz. Most likely, I'm spending time on Instagram. It's more fun over there. And you can find the cast at EDHRECast everywhere online. Plus, if you have a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Maybe send us a challenge of stats. It could be fun. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for their fantastic work in the post-production of the show. It's so much fun editing with you, Chase. Thank you. You can find them online at Mana Curves. And listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.